I specifically avoided places where a lot of people were, and I waited for them to go away before I went and checked it out myself. So that was one kind of social experience, and it definitely was very junk space like in that it was clearly procedurally generated. The environment was very in your face. It could change easily. And the other app that I tried out, which was social um, in a way I could hang out with friends. I think it's called Gravity or something. It's one of the 3D sculpting apps. So a friend of mine pulled a meeting together. So three of us joined together in the 3D environment, and we were basically sculpting things together. And this was kind of interesting. It was like having this kind of Discord chat. So there was like an audio channel with the three of us chatting. And the guy who organized the meeting knew a lot more. So he was kind of like instructing us. It was almost a tutorial session. And all three of us were like, building things, breaking things together. And you could do things like zoom in, zoom out, become big, become small. So even though how do you put it? It's not a game of like individuals interacting with each other, but individuals interacting with the environment. So we were collectively sculpting an object together, and you could make the object small or big. So in relation to it, you could become a giant or a tiny person. So in that sense, the relative social relations could become like, giant to small person or like equal size, depending on how you were dealing with the object. So I could become a giant and like smash the object with my fist when somebody else was trying to make very fine adjustments to the object. So kind of interesting. I think Metaverse is definitely, if it's built right in a way that people can use and modify and evolve, it's going to be a lot more like junk space and almost not at all like the Simon type classical fixed structure. Anyway, so I know Mayor has to drop off, but so yeah, Mayor, you have any quick, or did he already drop off? I think so. Okay. Let's see. Oh, Jenna, you joined, so you have thoughts on either or both articles?
I'm just catching up, Venkat, so I'll stay in listen mode. Thanks.
All right. So I think both Ben and Gregory, you didn't share thoughts on the metaverse part of the prompt, so let's tackle that. So yeah, Ben, metaverse.
All right, so if we're talking metaverse, I have to link this because I find it very interesting. And you didn't actually define what metaverse was supposed to be. So I'm going to steal Ben Hunt's definition of metaverse and show it all to you. He finds it in this article. So he's actually using something much more general than how the word tends to be used as sort of like a virtual reality. He thinks the metaverse, or he defines the metaverse in contrast to, say, what he calls the microverse, which is like the universe of viruses and microscopic organisms and cells and so on that you can observe through a microscope or any other scientific equipment that can see very small stuff. And he talks about, there's a whole universe down there of different things. And he calls the metaverse this sort of universe of abstractions that exist inside brains. And he makes it very clear this is a physical thing. The abstractions you think of physically exist inside your brain. And if you imagine mapping out all the abstractions that everyone has as physical things, as physical structures of brain cells, you sort of end up with this map of narratives that's both a physical map. I mean, this is a thing that really exists in the universe. It's not a metaphorical map, but it is a very alien map. It's not something you generally think of as the ideas. You tend to think of ideas as narratives as abstractions instead of physical things. But the real ideas really are physical things in some level. And he talks about, and I think that's a very interesting way to define the metaverse. So I felt I have to share it with you. So how does that relate to these articles? If you think of the metaverse as not just something that's new, that's coming along, but something that's always been there, and that we're just finally getting equipment to really dive deep into it. There was always a world of narratives and abstractions, but only today can we put on the helmet and plug ourselves in Matrix style into them so they overwhelm all of our other senses. Now, I mean, we're not fully matrixed yet, but that's clearly where the metaverse is going. And it's interesting that, because bringing things back to Discord, I said Discord was Junkspace, and people disagreed, and I think I understand a bit about where the disagreement is coming from. So yeah, Discord is interesting. I find it interesting because if you imagine, like, so I have like a dozen or so different Discord servers I'm a part of, and they're incredibly wide ranging. Like I have some for mod video games, some for crypto stuff, some for political stuff, some for just clubs where I hang out with friends, or for some stuff even for works. And then you have something like the Yak Collective, which is almost different than all of those. And it's just a complete, like, there's nothing that links these groups together except the fact that I'm pretty much either some level of member. So in that sense, if you, that's why I keep thinking like a mall where you have all these different stores, and maybe there's some attempt to in a mall, and it really, a mall does try to present itself more as a unified front as opposed to just a random collection of stores. Though at the end of the day, Junkspace implies that you'll end up a random collection of stores. That's where entropy wants to go. So I look over my Discord bar, and it seems like a random collection of groups of wildly different levels of membership. And that's what makes me think of, all right, it's sort of a mess. And that pushes me towards the idea of a junk space. Would the metaverse be like that? So how much do you think the metaverse is going to force itself? Because Discord, although it is sort of a mess, these different sort of subsystems don't interact with each other. None of these Discord servers I'm part of, you probably even know each other exist. So, in fact, you probably could uniquely define me just by the list of servers that I have. There's likely no one else that has this exact list. But yeah, the medium of the message, the message of the medium is different than sort of the classical junk space, sort of pseudo-public space where you have this sort of enforced deep corporatism over a veneer of these separate individual groups, whereas sort of like technically speaking, Discord still has the enforced deep corporatism. If any of these groups I was part of was doing something Discord really didn't like, they would find themselves disappeared and evicted quite quickly, and wouldn't really have any sort of power to stop that. So in that sense, it's really not a public space. But so in that part, I would definitely compare it to a mall, where if a store is not seen as respectable, it gets evicted. Will the metaverse be like that? I guess it's a question of which metaverse. Will the metaverse be sort of like the global metaverse? Will it be like the internet in that it's what the internet used to be, where there's lots of spaces that don't really interact, or that there doesn't seem to be long-reaching arms of power across? Or will it be more like a mall, where like Facebook's metaverse, where if Facebook doesn't like you, then you're not part of the metaverse anymore? So I think that's a interesting way to view it. Guess I'm rambling a bit, so I'll pass it on in case anyone wants to talk more.
Gregory, you have speculations on Metaverse?
Well, not much, because I'm not a user of Metaverse yet. Not an early adopter of it. However, my take would be that it is interesting because it's an exploration of what happens when we remove some constraints. And one of the major constraints that I can see is a constraint of a space. It used to be that, you live in a particular place and you have particular neighbors. And you have to talk to your neighbors, and you have to maintain relationship with your neighbors. Whether you like them or not, it's kind of out of your control a little bit. It's all kind of spatial relationships mapped into intellectual relationships and taking precedence over it. In Metaverse, in my view, the spatial constraints are removed. Something else has to appear. But in many cases, we have to discover what is that that can be seen as a spatial constraints in Metaverse. Which people will you choose to talk to? Which groups will you choose to join? Which games will you choose to play? It has nothing to do with, traditional space. And I will pass it on probably to the next person, which is Jenna.
I have two kind of themes that I'll throw out as part of this, which is, in truth, it's everything is just one big system. And so what both of these pieces are talking about are making up ways of deciding, are kind of arbitrarily, that they're edges. And so this is a system and that's a different system. And then the other theme to me that is coming through is around just levels of chaos. So Junkspace is, especially the way that Rem wrote that piece, extremely chaotic kind of feeling. And, any tough part of town is going to feel like that. And then Simon comes from the clean edges. Not really, of course, I don't think he actually would say this, but that everything can get tidy. We can tidy things up if we want to by making decisions about what we're counting. I also have been thinking about the nearly decomposable. It's an odd word, that word nearly. Never mind that decomposable is itself also a weird word, but Simon is acknowledging that nothing can be completely decomposed when you're talking about systems because it's all one big system. So he's just using the word nearly, I think, to gesture towards that it is possible to draw edges arbitrarily or not. I think those were rather than round. I think that's what those are the pieces that I feel like I'm trying to feel in my way into what would be useful then too, because I have this practical bent. And so for inside our own Discord, whether the patterns that we're trying to lay in, it's okay for them to be out on the chaotic end of the spectrum. All Discords are that way. Ben, I feel like I've got all these Discords. I got a bunch more that I hardly pay any attention to, but once in a while it's fun to go see how other people are doing things. So inside our own Discord, what's the right amount of chaos to allow for is probably the most useful takeaway. So passing back to you, Venkat.
Yeah, there's the Simon article is kind of interesting because I think you could actually update it to use very modern terminology, and many of the ideas would suddenly become very much more familiar. So, for example, the nearly decomposable stuff, if you look at the examples he's thinking of, it's actually what today we call scale-free networks. That's how you would talk about them today. So the whole 6 degrees of separation, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon kind of stuff, that's what nearly decomposable means. And if you're not familiar with the history, the way that field evolved was people were initially studying what are known as random graphs. So you have a bunch of nodes, and if they're connected randomly, that's a random graph, and it doesn't have very much structure, and it's not very powerful. Like if it's n people in a random graph, it takes on the order of n to get a message from one person to another, because n people have to convey the message along. Whereas the 6 degrees kind of phenomenon is kind of interesting, because even if you have like almost 8 billion people on the planet, you can generally connect people with just 7 to 8 hops at most. And that kind of structure emerges because social groups tend to form networks that are lots of very tightly connected islands that are known as small worlds. And then the connections between those islands tend to be sort of weaker. So these are called small world graphs. So that's what nearly decomposable comes out to, which is if you were to cut the long distance links, you would end up with a bunch of small islands, and that's a small world graph. And the idea of a scale-free graph is slightly more complex. It's that the structure at all levels like a fractal, but it's still like nearly decomposable in the sense that you could cut away the big islands from the small islands and then recursively down, like chopping a cauliflower. That's what it would be like. That's what nearly decomposable is in 2020 terms. And you can do the similar kind of updating to other parts, like the evolvability and every part being stable. That's the edge of chaos idea that came after Simon about 15, 20 years later. The idea of comprehensibility that he's talking about, that's like compressibility today. So it's all his ideas are actually fairly modern, and I think that's a good way to check that they're actually all still valid. So in a way, a lot of what he says does describe modern systems, and it's a matter of emphasis on structure rather than evolution. I think that's the key thing. Uh, if you switch over to Junkspace, I think, Jenna, it's interesting that you kind of like casually use the metaphor of like bad part of town being chaotic, which is interesting because uh, Rem specifically uses very safe and kind of bourgeois context to talk about junk space, namely malls and airports, which are like not bad parts of town, but exactly the opposite, very safe middle class parts of town where most people feel comfortable. But it's chaotic in a different way in the sense that it's very disorienting to make sense of those spaces except in the context of your own intentions. So take an airport. You arrive there and you have to take a flight, and it might be a confusing maze, but you follow directions to your gate and you go there. Or you're transiting through an airport, you land in one gate and you find your way to another gate. And apart from like trying to find food and the bathroom, you might never make sense of it. Like Atlanta Airport is an example of this kind. Like I've flown through it a bunch of times, but it's confusing and messy and I don't like it. And I just go from point A to point B and never really explore. So it only makes sense in the light of your intention. But despite that, even though it's chaotic and doesn't make sense easily, you can very easily answer one important diagnostic question, which is it kind of like a lively, happening, up to date airport, or is it kind of a dead, abandoned, like, stale airport? And the way we answer the question is, I think, two variables. One is how busy is it? How many flights are landing and taking off, and how many people are going transiting through it? So that's one question we can typically answer very quickly once you land at an airport. And the other is like how economically viable is it? And the way you answer that question is, does the infrastructure look like it's changing quickly? Is the built environment being updated and refreshed? Are the stores and food outlets kind of like newish, or is it like stores that haven't been updated in like 20 years and are kind of crappy? So you can get a sense of the liveness and liveliness of the environment very easily, even if you can't orient easily in it. And in that sense, I think, to the extent a place Discord is more towards the junk space side, you can do that too. You drop in a Discord or a Slack or something, and you can very quickly get a sense of, is it happening or dead or somewhere in between. And I think it'll be even more obvious in the virtual reality type of metaverse. I haven't yet read the Ben Hunt piece. I will for the more general definition. But for the virtual reality part, I think you can very quickly tell when it's like a dead, old fashioned airport or a happening, evolving airport. So that's one point I wanted to make. The idea that uh, the health of a junk space is very much a function of how alive it seems at the moment, which I think is the biggest difference between the junk space idea and the Simon idea. Like if you update the Simon idea to modernity, the main difference with junk space is junk space brings in an element of how alive a thing is, which I think Simon kind of misses. He doesn't have a measure of aliveness. Um, so I'm also rambling a little bit, but the other big point I wanted to make is the effects that capital expenditure has on structure. And by that, I mean Discord is kind of like almost a nonprofit. It has VC funding, but it tends to run almost like an open source project. And if you put other things on the spectrum, like take Slack, it has much more authoritarian decisions. And you can tell that It's owned by Salesforce. It recently did a update to its like payment plans and how much messages you can retrieve. When you're in Slack, you can tell much more clearly that you're in a much more authoritarian environment, even though otherwise it's a software that's built kind of like Discord in many other ways. And you look at something like the Apple App Store with its like draconian policies and who's allowed to charge and not. Like just yesterday, I was watching Tim Sweeney, who's the CEO of Epic Games, tweeting about how the App Store is unfair in its policies. They just lost a big lawsuit with the App Store where they were not allowed to like have their own payment mechanism, so they have to pay the 30% charge that Apple imposes. But other apps like Netflix are allowed to not pay the 30% because they have like Apple has some arbitrary rules of are you presenting external content or internal content or something like that. And the reason I'm bringing up this point is the structure of a junk space and whether or not it sort of is in your face and kind of authoritarian is a function of like how much capital is required to make it happen. And the reason I take Facebook and its vision of the metaverse very seriously is even though there's other competing visions and like more abstract definitions around, the virtual reality component of uh, metaverse depends very strongly on a very big company having the power to like just build very cheap virtual reality headsets and the servers and cloud infrastructure just to support the whole thing. And to the extent that's true, metaverse is going to reflect the distribution of capital. Like it's going to be very much the way Facebook dictates because Facebook is pretty much the only company that can produce high quality headsets at a price point that most of us can afford. There are competing headsets, but I don't think they have the economic power to create a metaverse. So I think that'll actually create a very interesting challenge, as in, can an authoritarian high capital metaverse have the same kind of aliveness that I think junk space needs? And I think that's going to be the fundamental trade off. Like, can the, just as with a mall or an airport, which is, can the party that has the capital to make it happen also govern it in a way that keeps it alive and sort of, evolving? Anyway, so kind of messy, junky points. Actually, it's kind of weird. This conversation has turned into junk space. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Uh, and we have a few more minutes left. So yeah, any other thoughts?
So it's interesting that I think you talk about capital and how that ends up shaping the various structures and how Discord tends to. It's very. Oh yeah, it is very almost like an open source software project. Well, I'm not sure how long it'll last like that, but so far it has been. I haven't noticed it trying to control things, and yeah, Slack is a good counterexample because Slack is very focused on what it wants, and what it wants its the people on its platform to be doing. Like its refusal to add any sort of moderation tools explicitly because it wants people on there to be trusting of each other and not just to be random people that it pulled from the outside. And I mean, to bring something back to the crypto space, I'm trying not to shill, but I would be very interested. One of the things that I think the crypto space might have the power to do, but currently isn't very executed very well, is be able to provide capital to, in a way that might actually be able to counteract Facebook. Maybe I'm being too optimistic here, but it's certainly something that I would like to see and what I'm trying to do. But yeah, the capital structure of what actually gets built is fundamental to what is being built. It's the malls and the airports were all incredibly capital intensive, which was reflected in how they evolved, and how they're sort of like this pseudo-public, pseudo-private object that sort of, at the best, it can get the best of both worlds, but that's tends not to be stable, and it can often slide into the worst of both. Anyway, that's probably enough for me anyway.
I'll pop in with one more thought, and it's another sort of biomimicry thing that I'm fond of, which is one of my little side games this year has been fire making. There are these things called twig stoves you take out hiking that just can make a really hot fire with a bunch of just the little crappy pieces of twigs. And so if you read about fire making, it's the three, they always talk about the three things. You need fuel, you need airflow, and you need a heat source. And it has to do with some nice vectors of proximity of those three things in relation to each other. And I think it's just a perfect metaphor for when does a discord kind of, what does it need to hang together, and when does it get too quiet and falls apart. So I just wanted to chime in with that because I think it corresponds nicely with that aliveness phrase that you were using, Venkat, and also this general idea of chaos. Chaos is the world we all live in, and everything is actually chaotic. But really, chaotic is just a word for it's more than my brain can grok. Although there's measures of energy, how much movement. That's part of aliveness too. So I think there's just some neat thing we'll end up feeling our way into, which is how much energy does the discord need coming in from how many people, so that the ignition continues, the fire doesn't go out. Because I know a couple of discords that I started on that were really active, and then the fire went out. When the fire just goes out, it's pretty hard in the real world as well as on a discord to get it going again if it really goes stone cold. So back to our metaphor collection, which doesn't really exist. Okay, back to you, Venkat.
All right. Any more thoughts, Gregory?
Nope, don't have any.
All right. See you guys next week, and I think next week we'll actually have a guest, Ben Taylor and Mayor was discussing interesting paper on types of system theory and cybernetics, and they're going to lead a discussion on that. So I think, I forget where it's posted, it's in one of the channels that they were discussing, but the paper is posted, so we'll be discussing that next week. See you guys next week.
Thanks, everybody.